distinguished audience. In this panel, we will discuss the truth that has been evaporated. And it is a panel organized by the Turkish Medical Association on the occasion of the first year of the pandemic. And we will listen to Etienne Balibar first as our keynote speaker. Then we will have 3 other panelists. Today, we are organizing this panel, and it is a critical day for us. The authoritarianism in the political regime, which we have been experiencing for a long period here in Turkey, which some people define as fascism, populism, and we have experienced another threshold today. There are 2 incidents. The first one is related to an MP who is also a human rights defender, one of the leading human rights defenders. He defends the rights of everyone. He makes no distinction between rights and groups, and Mr. Faruk Gergerlioğlu lost his parliamentary immunity for posting a tweet on a social media, and his sentence was approved by the Court of Cassation first, and then his parliamentary immunity was lifted by the Parliament, although he applied to the Constitutional Court for a preliminary and interim measure. But the spokesperson of the Parliament objects that there is no need to wait for the judgment from the Constitutional Court. This is how he lost his parliamentary immunity. The second incident, which I would like to mention, is that we just learned the People's Democratic Party faces a court case launched by the chief public prosecutor. That means this political party might be dissolved. And the regime in Turkey is under the control of one mayor. No matter how you call it, it is dictatorship, even in the classical sense and traditional sense. While we discuss the truth which evaporates, we have experienced these 2 incidents just today. And of course, we will talk about these issues from the pandemic perspective. Etienne Balibar, who is our keynote speaker, he is one of the leading figures in the political philosophy, and we are extremely thrilled that he is with us. We read his studies, articles, books while we were studying. And for example, while I was doing my PhD, I read his books and studies, and I was dealing with, I have to admit, his studies about his contributions to the Marxism in the 20th century, equality and freedom, which are key concepts, and the concept of liberté, which he framed in 1989. And he is a leading figure of critical philosophy, critical Marxism, and we know him since the 60s in Turkey. Louis Althusser, who is his professor, if I may call him, and also a colleague of him, and they studied and worked together.
I was his student. I was just his student.
Race, nationalism, nation and class. These are concepts. To me, they are different, but he deals with all these concepts in an elegant way, in a detailed way, and these are key studies that we have read here. Of course, he studies on Althusser, And on the one of the books that was translated into Turkish is the Philosophy of Marx. There are some other studies that have not been translated into Turkish yet, but still a very important study for 21st century is the migration, refugees, citizens, and also ideas. These are important books where he discusses revolutionary proletarianism, and he discusses the objective definition of workers, and he searches for sujet of all these issues. Of course, these are important studies, and he's a public figure. He is a philosopher. His impact goes beyond France. And he dedicated one of his studies to the Academics for Peace supporters here in Turkey. And it is a study that is composed of 3 articles. We would like to thank him for being with us today. It's an honor and pleasure for us to be with him this evening. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much. Thank you, Dinser. So I heard what you were just saying about the new developments of the very, very worrying and in fact dramatic political situation in your country. You called it a dictatorship, and I agree with that term, which of course has a range of meanings, but believe that I'm extremely concerned, and if I could do more with some friends, of course, to support the democratic struggles and the vindication of their most basic rights by the Turkish people, I would gladly do so. This being said, I'm not really able to discuss this now, not only because I'm speaking from abroad and I lack the necessary updated, I would say, information, but also because I thought that I should seize the occasion that you are offering me to try and, I would say, establish some sort of conversation between us on subjects which, of course, are of common and very urgent interest as well. So I'm immensely grateful for your invitation, and I add that it is a great pleasure to return, so to speak, to Turkey, where I have been several times in now a little distant past. I still hope that I will be able to come back physically, but I'm happy to be there virtually and through our images. And I also thank you for the honor and the extremely interesting opportunity I'm offered to address the conference of the Turkish Medical Association in this moment. Now let me come to my subject, which is of course our common subject, the pandemic. I believe we all agree that a global pandemic is affecting us. And perhaps we should say it is affecting us all. But I will have to return, of course, to these formulas, these terms a little later. This is imposing, of course, on all of us, citizens of different countries in the world, certain immediate needs and urgencies. My young colleague, now a brilliant French anthropologist, Frédéric Keck, who's writing extensively on issues of contagious diseases and now the pandemic itself from an anthropological point of view, proposes, this is probably not absolutely original, but he's done it in a nice manner, to enumerate these urgencies around three categories: protection, precaution, and prevention. But behind these urgencies is something more general, momentous in a sense, which is in fact a change in our lives, a change in our way of life, a change in our understanding of life and its future, which I believe, and this will be one of my main themes today in this talk, a new perception of our solidarities. And at the same time, I will repeatedly return to this kind of unity of opposites, a new perception of our divisions, some of which are extremely deep and even brutal. Now, the pandemic, which literally or etymologically names or means that this disease or this illness called COVID-19, officially, there's a more complicated name for the virus itself, is a global one or planetary one, has been declared such officially, and I'll return to this in a minute, by the World Health Organization in the early months of 2020, that is about 1 year ago. It is affecting us all, but it is not affecting us all in the same manner. This is a point I think is extremely important. Among the most visible general differences are differences in temporalities, of course. The illness began, officially at least, in China, a little more than in a great Chinese city, Wuhan, more than a year ago, and it started to spread from there to different parts of the world, which were affected successively. It's been sometimes shown in the newspaper in a very interesting manner that the curves of the development, the increasing number of patients or people who are affected by the disease has a typical shape. And this is produced in one country after the other as a kind of mimetic, if you like, repetition. There's also the fact, of course, that the differences in temporalities are also differences in spatiality or geographic differences, inequalities in the general sense of the term. And this is very striking too. I mention only two examples, if you like. For a long period, it seemed to be the case that Africa would be a continent largely spared by the diffusion of the dissemination of the virus, and people, biologists, anthropologists, economists, etc., started to speculate on the reasons why Africa apparently, or some parts of Africa, were, so to speak, spared by the virus, even if other parts of the world with the same climate, such as Brazil, for example, were exactly in the opposite situation, after which the situation changed. And it changed for the worse, not for the best. Another interesting case is within Europe, where I am situated, and I would say we are situated, because I'm not taking Europe here to be the pure political institutional unit, but it's our region to which we all pertain. The situation seemed to be that a country like Germany, owing to certain tradition of social discipline and some also great advances in the realms of technology and a good economic organization would, so to speak, overcome the critical moment in a manner far superior or better than their neighbors, including, for example, France. And then at some point, this situation was reversed, or if it was not reversed, it was transformed into a greater homogeneity. From that point of view, of course, it would be extremely interesting to ask questions without giving premature answers about the apparent huge difference between the evolution of the pandemic in China itself and some neighboring countries of Asia and the situation in Europe or Africa or the Middle East or the Americas. In this very moment, 1 year, a little more than 1 year after the beginning of the pandemic, you hear voices which explain that in China, this pandemic is now in fact terminated. Whereas on the other, in the other part of the world, it is still developing and growing. Now, all these differences, of course, have effects on the development of the pandemic itself, because they are not independent of who is affected, of the bearers. I will return to that. But they show, of course, that the name pandemic covers an enormous complexity. What I also want to stress to begin with, in very general terms, is that despite these differences and these enormous inequalities, it is not really possible to say or to declare that the humans have become isolated from one another by the illness. I will qualify this idea in a moment, but for the time being, of course, I want to insist on the idea that in a sense, and very tragically in a sense, the development of the illness seems to be part of the great process of globalization, which tears down, if you like, the barriers separating different parts of humankind. So we have here to do with a complexity, which is, of course, itself obviously overdetermined by political circumstances, social policies, in some cases even religious policies, degrees of democracy or authoritarianism in the national governments, conflicts between nations, and so on. And I also want to insist right away on the fact that this picture is not purely sanitary or medical. It's not purely environmental, although we'll have to return to that. It's not purely economic or geopolitical, but it also has an extremely strong moral dimension, moral component. And in a sense, my talk today is essentially aiming at trying to elucidate some of the circumstances and conditions in which we confront these moral issues. Now, I will try to do this. I should accelerate a little bit, otherwise we won't have time for the discussion, under four successive headings, trying not to expand them abusively. First, I want to ask your permission to propose some critical remarks on the very category pandemic. I begin with some considerations on the terminological issues, the terminology that we are using when we want to describe, to define, and of course, as a consequence, to govern. I'll also return to that term, the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, of course, I am a philosopher by training and by occupation. So this is a terrain on which not like most of you who are doctors and perhaps biologists. I'm not really competent. I try to progressively rectify my ideas. But I think that this is also of very general interest. And so I did my best to improve my understanding of this issue, and I submit it to you for possible discussion. Thank you for coming back, Neil Gunn. I want to see you, because so let me very quickly indicate 3 points that I find of interest. The first is, this is extremely well known, that the pandemic is defined, at least in its origin, but the origin stays with us, so to speak, as a zoonosis, which means that the pathogen, in this case the SARS, etc. Virus, has, I quote, crossed the species barrier. Therefore, of course, a fundamental question is introduced in an implicit manner, to which I'll try to return at the end. What do we call a species? And particularly, how do we define, how do we apply the category species to the human? In relation, of course, with others in a concrete situation like this, not just from the point of view of typologies in the theory of evolution. I think that another very interesting point related to this is the fact that the World Health Organization and other scholars, of course, in the recent past have published figures which seem to be reliable. I don't have them with me now, but I quote off memory, that clearly indicate that the number and the frequency of zoonoses is continuously increasing in the last period, due in particular to, or seemingly, to the drastic and dramatic changes in the environment, such as deforestation, increasing pressure, demographic pressure on wild life, development of industrial agriculture and breeding of animals, etc. So other important cases, of course, are flus, the previous SARS, the AIDS, etc. So that increases, I believe, the interest for the philosopher and the intellectual or the enlightened citizen, I would say, to reflect on our uses of the category species. The second point, which takes us closer to our subject today, has to do with using the category pandemic rather than simply epidemic. So we know, of course, that this is an official issue. I mean, this is a legal issue. And in particular that at the very beginning, a year ago or so, there had been, from this point of view, a discrepancy or a disagreement between the Chinese government and the World Health Organization, despite what has been presented as their excellent relationships at the time, quite different, for example, from the conflict with President Trump in America. The World Health Organization wanted to declare a state of pandemic, while the Chinese government, for some time at least, rejected this category and therefore wanted to remain with the simple notion of epidemic. Reason for that, of course, is in particular the fact that the official declaration of a pandemic has legal and therefore has inevitably also political consequences. Governments in the world, everywhere in the world, have obligations to inquire, to allow for investigations, and to make available all the information they have for the rest of the world, and also, of course, to implement measures of protection of their own population, which also have repercussions for other populations in the world. But the interest of this, and I finish with that, is also that shifting from epidemic to pandemic is not a purely present issue. It has retrospective historical dimensions. If only you go to Wikipedia, which we all do, and look for lists or registers of epidemics and pandemics in the past, you discover very strange and interesting things. There are retrospectively, of course, great epidemics which are simply presented as pandemics, such as certain medieval and early modern plagues, or above all, of course, the Spanish flu at the end of World War I, that killed twice the number of people the war itself had killed, or more recently, AIDS. But I found it very interesting that, for example, for what concerns the elimination, and we might even call it an extermination of Native American populations as a result of the European conquest in the 16th century, the word pandemic is reluctantly used. And one of the reasons for that, of course, seems to be that the death rate was not among Native American Indians, was not due to a single illness, but to a wide range of infectious diseases against which they were not immunized, and that the conquerors, Columbus, brought with them to America. Now, of course, all this is also linked, and that's again a moral aspect of the problem, to very traumatic experiences of death, or with living with mass death. But we have a certain tendency to believe that a pandemic is more murderous than any particular epidemic, or kills more. And then you have people who explain to us, you see, this pandemic, the COVID-19, is not so lethal. I mean, of course, with time passing, the amount of the death rate is growing, but it's nothing compared to the Spanish flu or to another similar event, which of course calls for a very accurate, I would say, political and moral discussion. One of the reasons why the death rate, which is huge, I admit, is not higher than than what we observe, being precisely the fact that declared as a pandemic, the COVID-19 provoked or produced a series of measures of isolation and confinement, which hold it back, so to speak. Okay. And finally, and perhaps for what will come now, the most important terminological remark in my eyes is something that occurred to me only recently, because at the time I was not aware of the fact that a renowned scholar, Dr. Richard Horton, who is the chief editor of the famous biological and medical journal, The Lancet, published in Britain, had issued an op-ed, an editorial, on September 26th of 2020, that's already more than several months ago, in which I suggest, if you don't know it, that you find it easily on the internet. He would explain that the name pandemic was not a good name. And he said, this is not a pandemic. We should use another category, which of course is not really well known, not publicly used, although he did not invent it for the circumstance. We should call it a syndemic. A syndemic. And what he had in mind in using this term or proposing this term, which I gladly accept, even if I continue to talk of pandemic as we all do, was first the idea that we should not enclose our reflections in a purely medical within a purely medical viewpoint, but move or make it broader, acquire a broader view, which I would call which I would call anthropological. And I would gladly bring in here the famous category from the great French 20th century, early 20th century French anthropologist Marcel Mauss, who coined the expression the total social phenomenon. So I'm tempted to say the point of view that we are asked to take here is the point of view of a total social phenomenon. And this is how we want to discuss the pandemic. But then he has another reason which is equally interesting. He says, in fact, contrary to what is in the fore, I mean, presented everywhere, this is not a situation in which there is a single illness or disease that is killing people. In fact, it acts as a comorbidity in many cases. We can read it also the reverse way. So people die of many different illnesses which are aggravated by the COVID, or which are aggravated as a consequence of the fact that the COVID disturbs the functioning, the working of the medical system. For example, people who are expelled, I'm sorry for the brutality of the word, from hospitals to make room for COVID patients and so on. And finally, of course, they are the victims of social violence, which is intensified by the situation. So I propose a little variant on the previous formulation. This is, of course, a pandemic. I'm not going to contest that, but around the pandemic and developing the whole complexity of its consequences is something like a pathological condition of the society as such. Now, let's try and accelerate a little. Let's say a few things now on the second point, which is regards the composition or the texture. I'm trying to find the best formulation or the structure, if you prefer, of this pathological condition. Pathological condition of whom? Pathological condition for whom? Of course, human beings, albeit, as I said before, unequally or in a differentiated manner. In a moment, I will call this, I announce it in advance, the differential vulnerabilities. The differential vulnerability of humans with respect to the disease. So human beings, but also other beings, something we should never forget. And these other beings, particularly animals, life, animal forms of life, are not located only on the side of the causes, they're also located on the side of the effects. You may remember, or you may have seen that at some point, when it was discovered in Denmark and China that animals who are bred for their fur In French they are called visons, but I never remember the English name, had been contaminated in turn. Measures, of course, of extermination were taken against these animals who could become vectors of the disease. So the society, if you like, which is concerned here, is not a purely human society. It's open towards other forms of life. Nevertheless, it remains, of course, at least for our own interest, centered on the question of humankind and the unity of humankind. And here we could have a long discussion, which I will cut short, because the categories are not, of course, innocent. So do we see humankind as a society? Do we believe that humankind is a single society? I would not say so. Do we say that that humankind is a population, which perhaps biologists and epidemiologists would prefer? Yes, certainly, but with, interestingly, of course, sub-populations whose status is changing. My tentative proposal, in fact, is to move to a different level and to say that what is affected is not human beings as individuals, but pathologically, but are essentially the social relationships among humans, or, if you prefer, the human individuals in their relationships to one another, which of course are constitutive of their life, of their possibilities and modalities of life, both biologically and culturally, or even politically. So let's delve a little bit more into this question. Who is ill? Of course, individuals, primarily. This is an extremely important point. Therefore, individuals have to wear masks. Individuals have to become vaccinated. Individuals are dying when they are dying, or they are cured. But the key question at some point becomes the following: how do the individuals receive the pathogen, the virus, from other individuals, of course, through something called contagion? And what do they do, if I may say so, which is a little, of course, provocative, with their viruses, or the viruses affecting them individually? Of course, they transmit it. They transmit them, they transfer them or not, depending on the precautions that are taken. And as a consequence, of course, the concrete elements that we have to consider are more collective. Individuals form so-called clusters. They belong to networks which are connected through displacements, travels, etc., along certain routes. And we should take the category route here in its most diverse and general meaning. Of course, spatial, geographic routes or roads, and etc., but also, of course, itineraries which make it possible for humans to connect with other humans in their neighborhood, in their city, in their country, or in the world. Now, let's turn to the other side. How is the pandemic treated? So the pandemic is, of course, again, the same dichotomy, is treated individually. Patients are given or not antiviral drugs. They are brought to hospital for respiratory support, receive oxygen, etc. They're vaccinated individually when they are. For example, I have been vaccinated some weeks ago because I'm in the category of the elderly. But in the waiting for what is interestingly called a collective immunity, if this collective immunity is ever to be reached, because it is announced to us almost every day or day after day as likely objective for the near future, but in fact we have less and less certainties about that. The treatment, of course, is not cannot be purely individual. It has to be collective. It has to be prophylactic, like in every epidemic, of course. And this is, in particular, one of the reasons why some extremely interesting work of description and interpretation about past procedures or dispositives of the isolation of population during epidemics, great epidemics in the past, plagues and so on, cholera, or even flu, made by historians. The French philosopher, historian Michel Foucault in particular, are powerfully returning into the theoretical and scholarly dispute these days. Now, prophylaxis involves, as we know, isolation. Isolation, and I'm tempted to use the category isolation in the most general possible, in the widest possible sense. So isolation begins with the mask. In the case of AIDS, it began with the condom. So at the micro level, but this is already, of course, a relational element. And it continues, of course, through lockdowns, confinements, interdictions to travel, erection of new national barriers, the possibility of installing passports, of creating passports, a new type and a new era of the use of passports, etc. That takes us to another aspect, which is, of course, regulation of movements. And regulation of movement is a fact, but behind that is clearly a new problematic of the regulation of mobility. Mobility at work, mobility at leisure, mobility at education. And here today we are a clear example of that, with all the good sides in a sense, because without Zoom I would not be talking to you all, and also in a sense the catastrophic or terrifying possible consequences of that, which amount in fact in some cases to destruction of pedagogic activities or cultural collective events. What a French journal this morning, and I seized on that, of course, called the Zoomification of the population. We are zoomified in this. So this again raises the question of the differential and the differences, the different situation of people with respect to that. The population becomes once again, perhaps, distributed into categories, which are specific categories in a situation of pandemic, categories of risk, who is at risk, categories of dangerosity, who is dangerous, which people should you avoid meeting in the street or in life, categories of utility. And I find this especially important. I'm not sure the terminology is the same in every country, but in France, during the first confinement or lockdown, the government immediately proposed the distinction between two kinds of professions and jobs. The ones deemed to be essential, which could not be stopped, had to be kept working at all costs, and those who were or would be inessential, and for that reason could be halted for an indefinite time. At the beginning, of course, it was supposed to be short, and it proved to be very long. And as you know, there were heavy conflicts about that, because the grocery is supposed to be essential, but the school is supposed to be essential, but the movie theater is not essential. The museum is not essential, even if it's not so dangerous. In fact, at some point it was declared that the churches were essential, but again, the movie theater not, and so on. So this is clearly an important moral as well as social aspect. At this point, I suggest, and I move to the next point, two possible lines of consequences. First, the sanitary crisis is indeed an economic crisis. It is an economic crisis of unprecedented magnitude, at least since the 1930s in certain parts of the world. It is supposed to be exogenous, that is, a crisis that doesn't arise from economic processes such as speculation and so on, but from the so-called outside, that is, nature. The living environment and so on. Except that as the process, the crisis unfolds, continues, without predictable end, clearly the exogenous or the exterior becomes intrinsic or interior. And therefore, on the horizon, we have now something like a new definition of the economy in a long critical process. But above all, and I return always to the same point, this is a social crisis with decisive moral aspects. And I insist on this because I don't want to make caricatures, but I believe that the technocrats and our ruling elite is entirely made of technocrats, has a tendency to see the situation only as a correspondence or as an articulation of medical or sanitary issues, so vaccines, prophylactic protection, scientific investigation on the variants of the virus and so on, and on the other side, economic policies, monetary policies, how to overcome the unprecedented gap in social productivity. I insist on the idea that the sanitary and the economic are components of the situation, that the pathology we are dealing with, or the critical situation with which we are dealing, is social in the full sense of the term. It presents us with something like a decomposition, perhaps temporary. That is what we are told. But when will this temporary end, and how will it end? A temporary decomposition of social relationship, meaning interpersonal, personal. We are increasingly cut from the others, and especially the cultural dimension of these relations, which of course call into question the welfare institutions and the forms of solidarity on which our societies are built. There are, of course, especially dramatic cases. The case of the elderly is relatively well known. They die lonely, which is something never innocent in a society. But I'm particularly, perhaps because I was a professor myself all my life, and because I have grandchildren who are now in their early 20s, I'm especially concerned by the situation in the young generation. I think we observe, so the situation is not the same in every country, but everywhere we observe students who are no longer able to study because online teaching does not completely replace real pedagogic activities, even if I do my online teaching, and we observe dramatic effects of moral destruction and destructivity, rising rates of suicides, of depressions, and that does not concern only students, it concerns particularly the young generations in our countries. Recently in France, and I'm sure this is also the case in other places, we observed a surge in the violent conflicts, clashes between so-called gangs of youngsters. Now, of course, there are all sorts of causes. They are unemployed, they are uneducated, they are racially discriminated, and so on and so on. But the fact is that this becomes also part of the pathological condition I'm trying to describe. So I'm not trying to be pathetic. I just want to stress the fact that the complexity of the crisis calls for something like a double reading or a double perspective of this pathology, a medical and biological reading, undoubtedly, but also a social and moral reading on the other side. This is a dangerous illness, therefore a biological event, even if it's more or less kept under control, affecting human beings as organisms. And this is a crisis or a pathology of the social bond and the social interactions. So that, of course, cannot remain without consequences when we come to the question of policies. Third point, humankind is composed and decomposed in this situation. So this is, of course, an attempt at providing dialectical formulation. I'm using the category of the unity of opposites, which I hope is not too enigmatic, to propose something like a dialectical perception or representation of the conflictual, the very strongly conflictual aspects that this pandemic reveals once again in the human condition. My central idea, which I propose very simply to make things clear, is the following. The pandemic, qua also social pathology or syndemic, as Horton would say, is revealing and developing a contradiction, a unity of opposites with two antithetic aspects, which nevertheless are absolutely inseparable. On the one side, a new form or a new level of unification of the human population or the human species, if you prefer. And a contrario, on the other side, new manifestations of division, antagonism among humans, which amount to something I have proposed recently to call an anthropological rift or an anthropological fracture. The unity is a combination of processes, of different processes. Global but they all involve something like a global circulation. However, the interesting thing is the global circulation takes place below the interpersonal level, the level of social relationship, and it takes place above this level. There is, on one side, contamination of cells by viruses. This is a form of circulation. And there is transportation of humans and commodities who are actual and potential vectors across the planet. The divisions or antagonisms are themselves both a result of what we can call, I've already used that terminology, differential vulnerabilities of individuals, of groups, of categories before the infection. And of course, also, this is the most worrying, the most disturbing from a moral point of view, the result of different or even differential access of people across the planet, the world, to medication and vaccines. In fact, I dare to say, discriminations in the reactions of the society towards its own members. And finally, of course, it's also the result of the huge system of isolation and barriers, which for how long we don't know, constitutes the major dispositive of control, limitation, and treatment of the pandemic. Let me add two quick remarks on each point. On the side of the unification, I said this is unification from below and from above. From below, because viruses, and here I hope a good serious biologist will not make laugh of my very rudimentary expertise. A virus with its variants, the viruses with their variants are suborganic units, sequences of RNA plus protein, that is of the order of magnitude of the genome or between the genome and the cell. They're circulating or traveling between organisms, animal and human, and therefore they are really materially connecting them in the real, albeit invisibly, of course, or not directly visible. So in a pandemic like this, humankind does not only, I dare this formula, does not only share among themselves a genetic pool, but they also share a population of viruses circulating among them and connecting them in the real to one another. However, the viruses, like Marx said of commodities in a famous passage, the commodity doesn't go itself by itself to the market. The viruses do not travel alone. You'll never see a virus alone taking a train or a boat or a bus or a plane. They travel by themselves in a very narrow environment, for example, in the air in a single room. So they must be transported. And therefore, they must form, or they do form, with humans, something I'm tempted to call a traveling association or traveling coupling. And therefore, of course, the main strategy of protection and prevention, as Frederick said, Keck said, forces or leads us to controlling this association. And this, of course, reveals the importance in today's infection of the global system, the global capitalist, let's call it by its name, the global capitalist system of communications reaching the stage of what Marx had called the stage of totality. Now, of course, there's a long history of that totality. If you compare with the Spanish flu, the decisive factor, as we know, was the fact that was the war, or better said, was the fact that troops would travel from all the extremities of the world, Australia, America, etc., to fight, to combat on the European soil, and then return to their homeland. Today, it's a much more sophisticated and complete and complex system of global communications, which is one of the components, I would say, and the causes of this material unification through the transportation or the displacement of viruses. This creates something I call a passive unification. Passive unification or a passive synthesis of the human species. But then we have the other side, which I already mentioned, namely the anthropological rifts or fractures. And here, of course, we might restart from the control of movements. We observe that we're entering a new era of borders and border controls, which are national, continental, regional, local, etc., heightened by inflammatory ethnic and geopolitical antagonisms. Things, of course, since we were talking of unequal access and discriminations in the distribution of drugs of the current vaccine war, which is a war, of course, in the metaphoric sense, between corporations and between countries. But when we reflect on the unity and disunity of the human, something equally or perhaps even more fundamental has to be taken into account, which is, as I said, the differential vulnerabilities and the medical discriminations. Now, the differential vulnerabilities have to do with so-called risk factors, not only pre-existing conditions, however important they are, and comorbidities, but most of the time, as we know, these comorbidities are not independent from other factors, racial and class in particular. So I can't go into detail, we have to check that carefully, but we begin to understand that differences of generation, differences of gender and sexuality associated, of course, with jobs and occupations in the society, differences of race and ethnicity, differences of class. That's extremely important, of course, because not every job is exposed in the same manner, because differences of revenues, of housing, of education. I was speaking of the possibility of working at home with digital instruments or not, precariousness in general, mobility and immobility are deeply affecting the effects of the contamination, together, of course, with geographic differences. And here, this will be a whole chapter. Because in fact, of course, these geographic differences arise from the history of colonization, but they are no longer as simple as a division between North and South. All these factors, differential factors of vulnerability, are intersecting. This is absolutely the moment to use this very important category. And they are also involving, I insist on that, forms of violence and sometimes extreme violence. I even believe that we border to genocidal phenomena. I have two examples in mind about that. First, autochthonous people, particularly in the case of the Brazilian situation, who are, and that reminds us, of course, of the extermination of Native American Indians 5 centuries ago. They are not only not immunized, but exposed, in fact, willingly to a new moment of their elimination. And I also think of migrants and refugees. So I don't know exactly what the situation is in Turkey in this moment, where you have so many refugees and migrants. But in a neighboring country with which you have so strong ties, that is Greece, you know that the situation is tragic. And I was very impressed some time ago by the fact that the refugees who are enclosed or imprisoned by the tens of thousands in the camp of Lesbos and Moria issued a very dignified declaration addressed to the at the European leadership. I mean, the Brussels, Mrs. von der Leyen, and so on, and in which they said, we are not allowed to leave this camp, but this camp would become a death camp because of the pandemic. I'm even tempted to say that there's something like a quasi-racial form of division that is emerging. I am afraid I've been speaking much too long. Do I still have a few minutes, or is that too much? Can I take a few more minutes? Okay, so I'll do that quickly.
Yes, you have some time.
Yes, thank you. So I want now to propose two different sets of conclusions or concluding remarks. However, fragile this may be. So some are very speculative, and I'll be very quick on that, philosophical, and others are perhaps more practical. So on the speculative side, I would say that it is, of course, time now to return to the initial question: what do we mean with or by human species, a species that is affected as such by the pandemic, but also, and more generally, the pathological condition I was trying to describe, but also affected in its relationship to others. So the symptom, of course, of the importance of the problem is once again this formula, this almost mantra, the crossing of the species barrier. I'm impressed by that because I believe that a year ago or so, very, very few people in the world, in France in any case, would understand or would know this formula and understand the meaning of what it means to cross the species barrier. Whereas now, of course, this seems to have become a kind of commonsensical notion. And of course, this means that there is a relationship between the environment and the human population as a whole, as of course in the case of climate change and environmental destructions, but in a more pressing manner. And therefore, of course, it raises very strongly, very forcefully, the question of how to pass from this passive unification, this passive synthesis, which also results in deep fractures and divisions constitutive of contemporary humanity, if we how to pass from there to some sort of empowerment or agency or collective capacity to act on the causes for the present and of course for the future, since we are told, and this is certainly true, that this pandemic might be mastered, hopefully, or controlled at some point in the near future, but it's the first in a series that will continue in other forms. So the species we're talking about here is not a pure biological species, or rather, it remains, of course, how could it not be, a biological species, but as this species has been transformed by its own history, and particularly, I have no time to, perhaps in the discussion we can come to that, by the history during the capitalist modern era that has created or determined a qualitative leap, I would say, in the process of the artificialization of life, of which, of course, the industrialization of agriculture and breeding is a part, but the extraordinary developments of medicine and life-saving technologies is another side. So the passive unity calls for a becoming active or agent of humankind as such, which is, we realize, pure and simply the old cosmopolitical problem. But this cosmopolitical problem now emerges or appears in a new form, in new conditions, with new dimensions, or in more philosophical formulas, how to analyze this strange being, this strange case of a non-identical subject, object, as Lukács would say, that is humankind, and particularly how the objective dimension, or the passive, if you like, and the subjective, the active, are combined in political terms. So these are my last and absolutely final remarks about cosmopolitical imperatives. Of course, there are many of them, and I'm not pretending that I'm covering the whole issue, but I will isolate as immediate concerns and urgencies three of them. Which politics of the species and for the species do we need and can we try and define? Biopolitics, as Foucault proposed, of course, and also cosmopolitics, politics at the level of the planet itself, with local, of course, needs and imperatives, but with in fact, everywhere a global dimension. It's interesting that Foucault, whom I quoted a minute ago, coined the discussing biopolitics. He's not very much a theorist of the cosmopolitical, but he's a theorist of the biopolitical. And he coined the expression governmentality. Yeah. And I'm still wondering if there was or not a relationship to the fact that some transnational or supranational institutions, particularly the World Bank, themselves coined the category of governance in more or less the same period. I believe it was officially used in the early 1990s. So that leads to the question, how is the pandemic governed? Both in the sense of governance and the sense of governmentality. How is it governed globally, locally, but also globally? And of course, there would be a preliminary question, which is it governed? Is it governed? And here, I believe that the relevant comparison is with the question of climate change. Of course, the two things are not totally independent, and there are many ways of associating them. But politically speaking, so biopolitically and cosmopolitically, it seems to me that the situation is very different. I tend to believe, or I assert pessimistically, that the climate change is not governed. There are thousands of declarations. Some of them are treatises, officials, commitments of governments, etc., Green Deal program, etc. But these are words. Words, words, words. In practice, nothing is done that has any effect until now. Let's hope it changes, but until now, on the issue of climate change. Whereas you could not say that this is the case for the pandemic. Of course, the dimension is not the same, and the nature, the essence of the problem is not the same. So it's interesting from this point of view to refer, because we need to conclude, to the well-known motto of the World Health Organization, which is, as you probably know, one world, one health. This should be the guiding principle of such governance. Now, I have to say, regrettably, of course, that this principle is contradicted in practice. It's contradicted by, it's enunciated, and the World Health Organization is not without influence, I would say, on the development of the situation, but it's contradicted by rising nationalisms and by rising imperialisms, in fact, and perhaps even more, or at the same, in the same complex, by the overarching dominance of the principle of competition. The principle of competition does not only reign among countries, for example, China and Europe competing for the distribution of masks or viruses, and above all, of course, corporations competing with one another to invent and sell their vaccines, which had good sides, of course, because competitions creates emulation, but also at some point emerges as an enormous negative medical factor. But it's also the principle of competition at the very individual level. perhaps this has to do with something we call sometimes neoliberalism. When I met my physician a few days ago, he said to me, "Can you imagine that the doctors, the local doctors, and the pharmacists are now competing?" And the state is distributing the vaccines among between them in such a manner that they are competing with one another, and the patients are forced to compete with one another for who will get the vaccine. So this is the overarching principle. And of course, what I believe is not that against this competition, this general competition, we would need something like a global planification or planning, or a world government, or a global state, which we know cannot exist or would be worse. But we certainly need mass mobilizations across borders, so from below, again, with certain immediate objectives. And I see three of them, and I conclude with that. First, objectives of de-industrialization and de-artificialization, not of anything. Not de-industrialization of the production of drugs or any drugs, but de-artificialization of agriculture and decolonization of the environment in some particularly dramatic cases. Second, deprivatization, particularly of vaccines and antiviral medicine, directed, of course, against the all-powerful domination of what some economists and anthropologists call the big pharma, or the pharmacracy in the world. Dr. Ghebreyesus, the head of the World Health Organization, has tirelessly, in the last period, demanded that it is accepted and imposed in the case of COVID, what had partially, very partially, been achieved in the case of AIDS for a much more limited population, namely the lifting of the licenses that prevent each and every country under, of course, scientific control to reproduce the needed vaccines. Otherwise, Africa will be vaccinated in 2023 or 2025, and of course, the rest of the world will import the variants from Africa. And finally, I'm looking for a word, something like declosure, or the reversal of enclosure. That is, at least the lifting or the mitigation, the civilization, I'm tempted to say, of some of these barriers which are now erected everywhere. National barriers, local barriers, family barriers, professional barriers, something that cannot be done in any anarchic manner, but which also should not be taken for granted in the forms in which it is imposed on us today. I apologize for the extreme length and perhaps I'm afraid the abstraction of this talk. And I thank you very, very much for your kind attention.
Biz çok teşekkür ediyoruz.
We would like to thank you for your enlightening presentation.
Who is speaking, if I may ask? Is that Nilgün? Yes, okay.
Yes. So, yes, it is true that we are using 20 minutes of the following session, but it is really a pleasure to hear you. So I will summarize some of the questions to you. We have too many questions, but I need to compile and summarize them. And then you will have a few more minutes to respond to the question.
Yes.
But before that, We would like to thank our interpreters for their efforts because it is a very challenging subject to translate, but they did a great job. The first question is as follows. As I said, I am summarizing most of the questions to you. The first question. Metaphysics and also with this pandemic, this transcendency is also quite popular in this period. Do you think that following the COVID-19 period, what will be the new mentality which will be dominant after COVID-19? Popularism, transcendency, etc. And another question which is related to this one is this anti-vaccination is justified under the name of limiting individual liberties. On the one hand, governments use such issues for anti-vaccination, but how do you assess the anti-vaccination from the moral perspective that you described, and also from the political perspective? The governments are using and abusing the pandemic to ban demonstrations and gatherings. For example, we have a unique practice here in Turkey. Those who are over 65 cannot leave their homes. There is a discrimination on the basis of age. So can we discuss all these issues from the liberty perspective?
Yes.
And also can you elaborate the term pathology and how to overcome this issue? So you have a few more minutes to respond to all these points. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So I'll have to be very brief because I was extremely long, but I want first to acknowledge the quality, the relevance, and the importance of these questions. So I hope my answers will not be too disappointing. To begin with the first question, following the COVID-19, which mentalities, as you said, which I interpret as, since you mentioned transcendency, etc., as worldviews or conceptions of the world, will become dominant. And the answer, of course, is I don't know. I don't know. But what I do believe is that there could arise or emerge very radical changes, in fact, in the mass beliefs and convictions of many of our contemporaries. That will depend on cultural traditions. There's no doubt about that. It's always the case. But that will, above all, depend, of course, on the what I call the governance. I mean, the way in which the pathology and the pandemic is eventually treated. And particularly, perhaps, and I stop with that, particularly perhaps the way in which the ruling elites or the governments are able or not to manage what I would call the inevitable disappointment of the populations. And as a consequence, of course, delegitimization of some authorities. Because the discourse from the very beginning has been something like brace, be strong, and obey our orders. Of course, in some cases, like China, the orders are absolutely compulsory. In other cases, it's less the case. But everywhere, of course, the discipline was imposed with rationally an explanation which was, this will be short. And after that, we'll return to normal. But we are not returning to normal. We are entering an era of uncertainties. And in an era of uncertainties, the forms in which the populace is governed is bound to produce mass psychological and ideological effects. So I only hope, and that's one of the reasons why I proposed some objectives at the end, that the turn would not be massively to either completely irrational. I have nothing against transcendency. That's not the problem. As soon as death is on the order of the day, you need some sort of transcendency. But I'm hoping that this will not produce a massive shift towards xenophobic, nationalist, and conservative ideologies. But the basic answer is I don't know, except there will be changes. Second, anti-vaccination. I'm not very much for that. I'm not very much for that, and I would, but of course, I'm not, well, be careful. I'm not even against the idea that there are cases in which vaccination has to be compulsory, because we know, as many doctors say, and politicians as well, and I don't see anything that can object to that, that you're not vaccinated only for yourself, but you're vaccinated, hopefully, of course, in the best possible case, in order also to protect your relatives and the people with whom you interact. So just as vaccination became compulsory for certain great illnesses a century or 2 centuries ago, it might be the case that we need it now. Except that, of course, this could not be a trick. This should not be a trick to suppress individual liberties. So conviction and negotiation and democratic discussion are, of course, absolutely necessary. Third, governments are using and abusing the pandemic. This is Agamben. I'm delighted that you, Agamben's argument, I'm delighted that you raised the issue, because I, in fact, believe it or not, I don't have a black, white, dichotomic idea about that. What I dislike in Agamben's argument, what I don't agree with, is in fact the conspiratorial subtext, or even rationally. That is the idea that there is a kind of monster which you may call capitalist or capitalist state, or neoliberalism in its authoritarian variety, which was somehow eagerly awaiting circumstances which would make it possible to curb and crush our liberties, individual liberties and collective liberties. So the pandemic arrived, and this was marvelous. And therefore, of course, they immediately jumped on that and imposed every sort of restrictions. The restrictions are not the same everywhere, and they have to be carefully discussed. But the reason why I did not use the category state of exception that Agamben is using, but I use the category pathological condition, and if you find a better one, I'll gladly take it. I was also thinking of Gramsci's notion of the interregnum, to indicate that yes, this is a situation in which liberties, freedoms, autonomous ways of life are enormously at risk. And the least we can say is that many of our governments have no respect for that. And they are, in fact, not even able to understand why it would be important to preserve this autonomy in order to react collectively to the pandemic. So the problem is not just a problem of use. It's not a cunning in that sense, but it's really a problem of the state of the autonomy and the liberties in our societies. And then finally, how to overcome. As I tried to say, thinking, discussing, acting, and taking responsibilities.
Thank you.
Çok teşekkür ediyoruz.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. There are too many questions, as I said, but due to the limited time, I'm not able to ask all these questions, and I also apologize to the audience who asked these questions, because we need to move to the next session, but your presence made us stronger here. Thanks a lot for being with us.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you very much.